Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Phyrexia All Will Be One spoilers. So today we kick off week 2 of spoiler season, and my god, do we have some ridiculous cards to talk about. Maybe some of the most powerful cards we've seen from the entire set so far. And not just powerful, but super fun cards to brew around, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking Phyrexia All Will Be One. Before we do, 2 quick reminders. Number 1, if you need to pick up any of these cards, you can grab them from our awesome sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And number 2, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Phyrexia All Will Be One. First up today, we got a super spicy white mythic in Phyrexian Exemplar. So Phyrexian Exemplar, 4 white mana symbols for a 5/5 flying Phyrexian horror, and its ability is, if damage would be dealt to it, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, it deals that much damage to any other target. So, obvious comparison here is Phyrexian Obliterator, the white Phyrexian Obliterator. It has the same mana cost, it has evasion, it's a 5/5 for 4. The difference is the ability. The ability, it's kind of a very upgraded Dawn Elemental, a Dawn Elemental that's actually like a Boros Reckoner, which kind of makes it like a Brash Taunter or a Stuffy Dow. So level 1 Phyrexian Exemplar, you want to play this and then deal a bunch of damage to it. If you can play this and then Blasphemous Act, you get to throw 13 damage at something. If you can play this in Star of Extinction, you get to throw 20 damage at something. If you're playing a 1v1 format, it probably just wins you the game on the spot. So same shenanigans as like Stuffy Dow or Boros Reckoner or Spite Mare, which is pretty sweet. The question is, how good will this card actually be in Standard? So much like Phyrexian Obliterator, Phyrexian Obliterator, this card absolutely wrecks red decks. Red decks, I don't even know what they're going to do in Standard. Like, red removal is so bad against this. Your opponent abrades it, it doesn't do anything. You just throw 3 damage at something. They try to Rending Flame it, it prevents the damage. You throw 5 damage at something else. So that part's kind of ridiculous. On the other hand, much like Phyrexian Obliterator, it does die to non-damage based removal. You can kill it with a Go for the Throat, or exile with Brutal Cathar, or get it with Destroy Evil Soul Transfer. So there's plenty of ways to answer this if you're not playing a red deck. So the question's going to be, just how good is this card when you consider its mana cost? I think there are roles for this card for sure. Like, we've seen decks in Standard already casting Invoke Justice, which has 4 white mana symbols. That's not a big deal, even in like 2 and 3 color decks. So I think like mono white midrange with Wandering Emperor and Wedding Announcement seems like a nice fit there. Like, it's just a above the curve threat with a pretty sweet ability that your opponent's not going to want to tangle with in combat, because if they do, the damage is going to be prevented and you're going to kill one of their things or throw damage at their face. So I think there's homes. Mono white, Invoke Justice style decks, even 2 or 3 color decks. Like, if people can play Invoke Justice and people can play Invoke Despair in 3 color decks in Standard, I think we can make Phyrexian Exemplar work. The other place this is really going to shine is in White Devotion decks. White Devotion decks, maybe in Pioneer, maybe in Modern, maybe in Explorer, Historic, seems really designed for this card. It's essentially free if you have Nykthos going. You get 4 white mana symbols and you make all that mana back with Nykthos. And one of the things I've been struggling with White Devotion is, how do you actually close out the game? How do you close out the game? That is the big weakness of White Devotion. In a format like Pioneer or in a format like Explorer, you kind of got to cast like a big Eldrazi or something. But it's really cute that Phyrexian Exemplar, it's a good support piece, and then it would be easy enough to splash into red and play Star of Extinction or play the Blasphemous Act, something that just combo kills on the spot. So I'm interested in trying some sort of like mono white splashing red devotion with this plus one of those big damage burn spells being the payoff. There's also a ton of combos for this card, mostly for Commander, but you could play them in other formats. An easy one, Guilty Conscience. Put a Guilty Conscience on Phyrexian Exemplar. Guilty Conscience says, when enchanted creature deals damage, Guilty Conscience deals that much damage to enchanted creature. If you Guilty Conscience Phyrexian Exemplar, and then it takes any damage, that damage is going to trigger Phyrexian Exemplar to prevent it and throw that damage at something else. And then when Exemplar deals damage, that's going to trigger Guilty Conscience to throw that much damage at Exemplar again. And then Exemplar deals some damage to something else, and then Guilty Conscience to Phyrexian Exemplar. So essentially you get an infinite damage loop where you get to just kill your opponent on the spot. Also really cute with like Pariah or Pariah Shield, or as a one-shot Gideon Sacrifice. sacrifice. If you put a pry on this, all damage that's dealt to you goes to Phyrexian Exemplar, and then Phyrexian Exemplar redirects it to your opponent or one of their things. So essentially you just can't die to damage as long as you have this set up. Plus there's like even jankier combos. Probably my favorite jank combo is like Aetherflux Reservoir and then giving Phyrexian Exemplar lifelink with like Lockstone on Warhammer or Shadow Sphere. You equip up the Phyrexian Exemplar so it has lifelink. You get up to 50 life. Instead of sniping an opponent with Aetherflux Reservoir, you hit your Phyrexian Exemplar for 50 damage. That damage gets prevented. Exemplar deals 50 damage to one of your opponents, and then since it has lifelink, you gain back that 50 life, which lets you activate Aetherflux Reservoir again and hit the Exemplar and kill another opponent, and you do that till the table's dead. So Phyrexian Exemplar, I love this card. There's going to be sweet janky brews. We'll have to see just how good it is in Standard. Very, very similar to Phyrexian Obliterator, where Obliterator, it's got ridiculous stats. It's got a ridiculous ability, but it does kind of just die to removal, so it's usually fringe, unless you're a Devotion deck or have specific synergies for it. I'm afraid Phyrexian Exemplar might be kind of the same, where it's a really exciting, powerful card, but it might be a card that's more for specific decks or combos than something you just jam in every deck, especially with those 4 white mana symbols. We also got a pretty exciting sphere land in the Mycosynth Gardens. So Mycosynth Gardens enters the battlefield untaps. It makes colorless mana. It's got some bad mana fix, and you can pay 1 and tap it to make a mana of any color. So essentially you're paying 2 mana because you're tapping the gardens to make 1 mana. And then the real payoff here, pay X and tap it. Mycosynth Gardens becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. Notice, this is not until end of turn, so this permanently turns into a copy of an artifact. As far as Standard play, it's going to be really interesting to see how this shakes out. There's a lot of competition for the colorless land style. Like Blast Zone is really good. Mishra's Foundry. We got a bunch of other spheres. You got Roadside Reliquary, Field of Ruin. And most decks can only play a limited number of colorless lands because you got to be able to cast your colored spells. So I think there are decks that'll want Mycosynth Gardens, but probably not every deck. Like being able to copy a Reckoner Bankbuster, that's kind of sweet, although unfortunately you won't get the counters because that's an ETB trigger, so you're kind of just getting a vehicle out of it, which isn't as exciting. Maybe copying Phyrexian Flesh Quarter. Obviously, if you somehow can get a Phyrexian Portal on the battlefield and you have an RD1 and you have 9 mana, you can Mycosynth Gardens, get 2 of them going, which is pretty sweet. So there's definitely shenanigans here, although to me this feels like a card that is at its best outside of Standard. Not that there won't be some artifact deck in Standard that can use it, but outside of Standard, this card does some really exciting things. So for example, in Modern, there's this Prison Tron deck that I can never win a game with, but other people, bigger brains than I, win with it all the time. And you're trying to like play Ensnaring Bridges and play Mystical Pizza Ovens and eventually just kind of like lock your opponent out of the game. Garden seems perfect there. I love Ensnaring Bridge, one of my favorite cards. The problem is if you try to hide under the Ensnaring Bridge and then it dies, you often just die on the very next attack step. Mycosynth Gardens is a way you can just copy your Ensnaring Bridge if your opponent goes to kill it. I've seen Primeval Titan players talking about copying Amulet of Vigor. You can tutor up your Mycosynth Gardens Primeval Titan and then you do the shenanigans. Maybe Lantern Control copying one of your lock pieces. Also, I've seen people talking about Hammer Time. This one I'm not so sure about. So on one hand, 2 hammers is better than 1, and this is 1 mana make a hammer, and it does get around one of the downsides of Mycosynth Garden that we haven't talked about, which is if you activate Mycosynth Gardens, the artifact you make is going to be tapped, but a Colossus Hammer doesn't really care. It works just the same tapped as untapped. The challenge is there's already a lot of colorless lands in Hammer Time, like Inkmoth Nexus, really important to the deck. Urza Saga, just kind of a busted card. You're not going to cut that. Is there room for another colorless land in Hammer Time? If so, Mycosynth Gardens does seem fine for that deck. It seems good in the deck. I just don't know if there's enough room. Once you get back to Legacy, things become even more ridiculous. In Legacy, there's some weird Phyrexian Dreadnought decks. If you don't know Phyrexian Dreadnought, it's a 1 mana 12/12 trample. The problem is when it ETBs, you have to sacrifice 12 power worth of creatures or you sacrifice the Dreadnought. So there's decks that try to like Phyrexian Dreadnought and stifle the trigger to keep it around. Mycosynth Gardens is another way to keep your Phyrexian Dreadnought in play. You play your Dreadnought with the sacrifice trigger on the stack, you pay 1, tap your Mycosynth Gardens, copy the Dreadnought, but your Garden is already on the battlefield, so you don't get that negative ETB trigger, so it essentially just turns gardens into a 12/12 trampler. Seems like a nice backup plan for Stifle Maw. Another place this is really interesting is with Lion's Eye Diamond. Lion's Eye Diamond, easy way to combo off in a lot of decks. A Black Lotus, it makes you discard your hand essentially, but if you read Lion's Eye Diamond closely, you don't have to tap it and sacrifice it. Almost every card like this is tap, sack, make the mana. Lion's Eye Diamond does not have that tap clause, so that means if you make a tapped LED with Mycosynth Gardens, you can use that mana right away. So this is just tap, become a copy of LED, and then you proceed to combo off, do all your shenanigans, storm off or whatever, and win the game. And then in Commander, there's a ton of potential there as well. I don't want to say this is a staple in Commander that you'd play in every single deck, but I don't think it's super far from that, because its floor is copying good mana rock. Like this is pay 1, copy your Soul Ring, pay 0, copy your Mana Crypt, pay 2, copy Gear Monolith, or 3, copy Basalt Monolith. So that's a fine floor, and then if you're an artifact deck, it gets even better. If you're Osgir, or Mishra, or Imhotep, or Urza, if you're any colorless deck, you got tons of room for this because you have so much space for colorless lands. This is going to be an all-star, so I think at a minimum, this is an auto-include in like 2 color or less artifact decks in Commander, maybe even 3 and 4 color artifact decks in Commander, but definitely in 2 color and less artifacts decks. It seems absolutely insane. You can even activate it at instant speed, and then I could see trying in other decks as well, just to copy my mana rocks and make more mana. So Mycosynth Gardens, I think this is the best sphere that we've seen so far. Oddly, Standard might be its least impactful format, although I think it'll still see play there, but this has shenanigans all the way back to Modern and Legacy and Commander, and is probably going to do something busted in some deck in some format somewhere. We also got Tekuthal Dominus. Oh my goodness, this card is sweet. So this was another member of the mythic Panharmonicon cycle, I guess. The cycle of mythics that double something up. So this is a blue one. It's 4 mana for a 3/5 flying legendary Phyrexian horror. It says if you would proliferate twice instead, and you can pay 1 in double blue, remove 3 counters from among artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers you control to put an indestructible counter on it. This card is ridiculous for any sort of proliferate deck. So we already saw the white member of this cycle, Mondrak, which doubles up tokens. This is the same thing, but for proliferating, which admittedly is a little bit narrower, but can be even more powerful. We've seen a bunch of competitively costed proliferate cards, and Phyrexia will be one. Experimental Augury, Bloated Contaminator, New Veraska. So there's plenty of ways to proliferate. Not as many as just like making tokens or something, which is why I say Tekuthal's a little bit narrower than Mondrak, but still in the right deck, this card is absurd. And what would the right deck be for a card like this? And I think the most obvious answer is some sort of Superfriends deck. There's tons of planeswalkers in Standard. We're getting a ton of new ones in Phyrexia will be one, but this works especially well with a very specific type of planeswalker, which is planeswalkers that enter with an amount of loyalty that is 2 less than ultimating. So just in Standard, we have like Elspeth Resplendent, comes in with 5 loyalty, ultimates for 7. Ajani Sleep Rage, it comes in with 4, ultimates for 6. Tezzeret comes in with 4, ultimates for 6. Tamiyo comes in with 5, ultimates for 7. With any of these planeswalkers, if we get Tekuthal down and proliferate 1 time, we'll double proliferate, we can add 2 loyalty counters, and then immediately emblem our planeswalker and get that powerful ultimate, maybe even game-winning ultimate going. So I think any sort of Super Friends deck, this card is going to be absolutely bonkers. Also works pretty well with just the proliferate theme. We've been talking about throughout spoiler season, some really powerful cards. They have a drawback of running out of counters, like Archfiend of Dross, way above the curve, but if it runs out of oil counters, you're gonna die. Evolve Spinoderm, really strong card, but when it runs out of counters, it's gonna die. If we get Tekuthal and some proliferate going, we're gonna be able to keep our counters on these cards forever and turn them into very legitimate threats. Also, like Venser really cares about proliferating, so maybe there's a deck there where we just go full on proliferate mode. There's a bunch of other options in Standard as well, like works really well with Dragon Spark Reactor. Maybe we just try to add a million counters and burn our opponent out as we proliferate. Invigorating Hot Springs in the modified mechanic. If we're getting counters on our creatures, we proliferate, add twice as many counters, gonna get off to some really fast start. The Field Recycling. We already talked about how it doesn't seem that hard in a deck built around oil counters to get 10 damage out of this. It's gonna be way easier with Tekuthal doubling up those counters as we proliferate. Also seems like a really fun card for Commander. So obviously it can can be your commander. Just build like mono blue Superfriends, Proliferate, or whatever. Mono blue counters. That sounds like an interesting, unique archetype. Also great in any sort of proliferate or counter style deck in Commander, like Atraxa. It seems like the easiest combo. OG Atraxa proliferates every turn. You're adding twice as many counters to everything. Maybe you're trying to keep your cheesy alive and add counters to stuff so you have them to remove to keep your commander going. Or Venser proliferate. So I think that this card, it's absolutely ridiculous. I think it'll see less play than the white member of the cycle, just because there's way more token producers than proliferate cards. But in a proliferate deck, the card's kind of absurd. It's got good stats, it's got evasion, it can easily protect itself. Like, if you're playing a proliferate deck, you're gonna have counters on things. It seems pretty easy to play this for 5 mana, so you can immediately pay 1 in 4 life and make it indestructible if you need to. The card's ridiculous. So Tekuthal, I love this cycle. It's like this cycle was made just for me. I love doubling things. I love Panharmonicons. Sure, it's just proliferate, but in the right deck, proliferating twice instead of once is gonna do some absolutely ridiculous things. Speaking of proliferating and super friends, somehow we might have even gotten a better mythic for that archetype on the same day, in the same set, in the same color, in Ichormoon Gauntlets. And I gotta say, I think this card might actually just be straight up busted. This card legitimately scares me. We'll have to see if it has the Panharmonicon problem where it's too hard to take the turn off to get it on the battlefield, but my god, is this card ridiculous. So it's a 3 mana blue artifact. It says planeswalkers you control have 0 proliferate. So essentially all of your planeswalkers have +1 add a loyalty counter to all of your planeswalkers, and it's better than that if you got creatures with counters or whatever, or you're trying to infect someone. And then -12, take an extra turn after this one. And then it says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent, put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. This, I think, is the best Super Friends card that has ever been made. Like, this is a ridiculous card. It essentially gives all of your planeswalkers Chandra Acolyte of Flame's 0 ability, except it works for all planeswalkers, and like I said, it's even better because it's proliferate, so it works with non-planeswalkers as well. But if you're a Super Friends deck, having every single one of your planeswalkers have the option to just plus to add more loyalty to all of your stuff is an absurd ability. And then, if you get enough planeswalkers, as you keep 0 proliferating with some of your planeswalkers, you'll get a planeswalker up to enough loyalty where you take an extra turn, and then during that extra turn, you do it again. Like, if you get enough planeswalkers going, this can be a strange, weird, super frenzy, infinite turn combo deck. So that by itself is ridiculous, and that doesn't even include that when you cast a non-creature spell, you get to add a loyalty counter to any of your planeswalkers, or to other things as well. But in a Super Friends deck, that's just gonna supercharge the loyalty. So in Standard, we have all the pieces to make a ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous Super Friends deck. We have a bunch of good planeswalkers with more coming. We just talked about Tekuthal to double the proliferate. Can you imagine all of your planeswalkers having 0 proliferate twice? Essentially 0 add 2 loyalty to all your planeswalkers. It is going to be so easy to ultimate your planeswalkers. And then if they get high enough loyalty, even your bad planeswalkers are going to have a ridiculous ultimate because they can all take extra turns. The card is absolutely insane in Super Friends. And then it's also like this weird hardened scales or inexorable tide as you cast non-creature spells, where you're able to just keep adding counters to things. Not quite inexorable tide, which just lets you proliferate when you cast a non-creature spell, but even just adding a counter when you cast a non-creature spell is kind of bonkers. Imagine playing this in Modern or Historic or Pioneer with something like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. You play your Ichormoon Gauntlet, you play your Teferi, and then you counterspell and you add a loyalty to Teferi. You consider, you add a loyalty to your Teferi. You Supreme Verdict, you add a loyalty to your Teferi, and then if you need to, you can use the other like Proliferate ability, but you're probably just casting spells, adding loyalty. You're probably going to be able to ultimate your Teferi in 1 turn cycle with both of these cards on the battlefield. Same with like Liliana, same type of play pattern. You get this out, you get down your Liliana, you kill something with a Fatal Push, you consider, you counter a spell, you Wrath or whatever. Next thing you know, oh, my Liliana's got 6 loyalty. How about I get rid of the heftier permanents, it's going to be so easy to ultimate planeswalkers once you get this on the battlefield. This also means it is an absolute all-star, probably best card in your deck in any sort of Super Friends commander deck. If you're playing a Troxa Super Friends, a Zika Super Friends, Joda Super Friends, you want this card in your deck. It is going to be absolutely ridiculous. There's also some weird spell slinger potential. The first thing I thought of as far as the spell slinger mode is Vadric. Vadric wants you to be casting spells, and then it gets counters on itself, and as it gets counters, it makes your spells cheaper. It seems pretty easy to have Vadric and Ichormoon Gauntlet, and once you get a counter on Vadric, just sling your spells and keep adding counters, and next thing you know, all your spells are like 10 less mana or whatever. Also good with like Calamix that gets counters as you're casting your spells. The only question I have for this card is, do we have a little bit of the Panharmonicon problem? I love me my Panharmonicons, but one thing I know about Panharmonicon is it's difficult to take off turn 4 and do nothing, because then you're falling so far behind. You gotta hope that your Panharmonicon can catch you back up the following turn. Is Ichormoon Gauntlet gonna have that same problem in 1v1 formats? Are competitive players gonna look at this card and be like, it's win more. My planeswalkers are already pretty good. I would rather just be casting a removal spell on turn 3, or countering a spell on turn 3, or playing a creature on turn 3, rather than taking that turn off to set up for a ridiculous turn in the future. So maybe that's going to be an issue, but it's not an issue for me because I love winning more. People always say win more like a bad thing. I want to win more. I want to win in the most morious, most spectacular way possible. And Ichormoon Gauntlet in a planeswalker deck, or maybe in some other archetypes, is exactly that kind of card. So I'm honestly like blown away by this card, a little scared of this card. If anything, I think this card might be too good. We'll have to see. There's like a challenge you do need for it to be optimized and maximized. You do need a bunch of planeswalkers on the battlefield. By itself, it's not really doing much of anything, but if you can get that board state set up and get a few planeswalkers on the battlefield, this card is going to close out games super ridiculously fast for doing nothing. Like, just for doing what your deck wanted to do anyway, which is cast spells and cast planeswalkers. Next thing you know, you're accidentally going to be ultimating all your planeswalkers winning the game. So I am absolutely floored by this card. I'm a little scared that they printed this card. Out of anything in this set, this one's got the spidey senses tingling a little bit, like, oh no, is this card actually just too good? But we'll have to wait and see. So Ichormoon Gauntlet, I love it. We're going to be playing it. The card is absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. Moving on, we got a new blue cost reducer for instants and sorceries in Mindsplice Apparatus. So 4 mana artifact. It has flash, which is an interesting twitch. Says at the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on it, and then instants and sorcery spells you cast cause 1 less to cast for each oil counter on it. So this compares to a bunch of cards we've seen in the past. Jace's Sanctum, Arcane Melee, Vadric, sort of. Like, maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but Vadric also can reduce the cost of a spell by a lot if you build around it a little bit. And I think that's the upside of Mindsplice Apparatus. If you compare it to these other cards, which in all honesty have never really taken off in 60 card formats or even that much in 100 card formats like Commander, if you compare it to those other cards, there's 2 big upsides. One is flash, which means compared to like Jace's Sanctum, which is essentially the same card but an enchantment without flash, and you get to scry when you cast an instant or a sorcery. The upside of Mindsplice Apparatus, number 1, is you wait to your opponent's end step, you flash this in, you go to your upkeep, you get the first counter, and you immediately have all your mana to try to combo off with that cost reduction, which is a big one. The other upside is you can potentially grow this to get a huge cost reduction like Vadric. Waiting several turns, probably gonna be tricky. Like, I don't know if you want to try to like play this on turn 4, get an oil counter on turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, and get a big cost reduction. But we do have a couple of cards in Standard that could kind of make this a combo piece, like the Monumental Facade or Furnace Spellbomb have the abilities to just add oil counters to things. Furnace Spellbomb, for example, 1 to cast, you can pay 1 in a red, sack it, put 2 oil counters on an artifact you control, or a creature, and then you get to draw a card. So what this means is, you essentially, for 3 total mana, put 2 counters on Mindsplice Apparatus, so every instant and sorcery cast for the rest of the game is going to get a 2 mana discount. The Monumental Facade just taps, so you're kind of spending a mana because you're using a land to put a counter on something. So maybe these cards could really speed this up. If you can get 3 or 4 counters on this, all of your instants and sorceries are going to be absurdly cheap. Another way to go about this, especially in like maybe Pioneer, maybe Historic or Explorer, is play it in a flash deck. We have some payoffs for this, like Slitherwisp. When you cast a spell with flash, you get to draw a card and each opponent loses a life. This works really well with Mindsplice Apparatus. You play your Slitherwisp and you flash in the apparatus, you get to draw a card, and then all your counter spells and removal spells going to get a discount throughout the game. Also can ramp into it with Cunning Nightbonder, so maybe some sort of flash deck. Another thing I considered, and this is where I'm not sure this will actually work, would be like Modern Storm. So if you know Modern Storm, it's built around exactly these same cost reducers like Baral and Goblin Electromancer. The way the deck works is it really needs this 1 mana discount on its spells to turn the bad Modern Rituals and Manamorphoses into real like Dark Ritual effects. Mindsplice Apparatus does the same thing, and it has the upside that it's an artifact, which is probably going to be tougher to kill. The big downside of Baral and Electromancer is they die to pretty much everything, and if they die, it's really hard to combo off. Mindsplice Apparatus is going to be more resilient. You flash it in, untap, get that counter, storm off, win the game. Your opponent probably isn't going to have a removal spell for it. On the other hand, it does have a big drawback, which it costs twice as much mana. So if you're going to try to combo with Apparatus rather than Baral or Electromancer, the fastest you're going to storm off is turn 5, which might just be too slow for Modern. The other place that I think this could show up would be in some Commander Spellslinger decks like Talrand or Savine or Melik. Flash, again, is a nice upgrade here. I like that it grows throughout the game if it sticks out, and then you have these big like Spellslinger turns. Although we have Font of Magic, which is a 3-mana enchantment that gives instants and sorceries -1 mana for each time you've cast a commander from the command zone. So this is another one of these cost reducers that can kind of scale if you have cheap commanders and you cast them, or partners. It can be giving -2, -3 mana to all your spells, and that really hasn't shown up anywhere. So I'm really not sure what to think about Mindsplice Apparatus. My guess is it's mostly going to be unplayed, or maybe show up in like casual Spellslinger decks in Commander. That would be my guess. But the upside of this card, in the oil counter shenanigans and flash, it is intriguing, so I don't know, maybe it's going to be a little better than I think. Moving into the realm of lower rarity cards, we got some interesting ones. First off, Viral Spawning, 3-mana sorcery. You make a 3/3 green Phyrexian beast creature with Toxic 1, and then Corrupted. It essentially has flashback, so as long as an opponent has 3 poison counters, you can flash it back for 3 mana, make another beast token. So if you're a deck that can corrupt your opponent, this card's actually not that bad. It reminds me of Call of the Herd, which I know, it was 20 years ago, but 20 years ago, Call the Herd was like a legit card in Standard, and you even get a cheaper flashback. It's pretty interesting to see a great card from Standard's past be power crept, essentially, and maybe not even be playable anymore and knocked down to uncommon. But still, I think it's worth keeping in mind. The other thing to note about this card is it literally has flashback on it. Normally, if a mechanic's not in a set, Wizards doesn't keyword it. So instead of actually just saying flashback of 3, they would write out like, you can cast this from your graveyard by paying 2 and a green or whatever. However, Wizards has announced that flashback, it's going to be Decuduous, whatever that word is. That means not quite evergreen, but we can put in any set we want. So flashback, expect more of it in the future. We also got a whole cycle of Skullbombs. So we talked about Furnace Skullbomb a minute ago, but we got a whole cycle of them. They're at common. They all kind of do the same thing. 1 to cast, 1 to sack and draw a card, or some more mana, including colored mana, either 2 or 3 mana, to get an effect and draw a card. So these are worth mentioning just because we've seen these cards be playable in the past. We've had Spellbomb cycles in original Mirrodin, and then in our return to Mirrodin, Scars of Mirrodin, and they all saw a bit of play. Some of them even still show up back to Modern, where these you can tutor up with like Urza's Saga, which is kind of relevant. I think most of these rank a little bit behind the other Spellbombs, just because the cost to get their effect is more. If you compare like Surgical Skullbomb to Ether Spellbomb, which kind of does the same thing, but it's only 1 mana to activate. The upside is you get to draw a card no matter which mode you activate. When the old versions of these, the spell bombs, it's either just sack to draw a card or sack for the effect. So that might keep them out of Modern, but I don't know. But keep these cards in mind because cheap artifacts that can draw a card tend to show up somewhere in combo decks, decks that can tutor them out or whatever. So don't write these off as completely unplayable just because they're commons, because similar cards in the past have actually shown up in competitive 1v1 decks. We also got an uncommon Phyrexian Warrior, Infernus Punisher. So 3 mana for a 3/3 with Menace. Says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, Furnace Punisher deals 2 damage to that player unless they control 2 or more basic lands. So this card's kind of interesting. If you look at mono red style decks in Standard, the big 3-drop is Reckless Stormseeker, and I don't think Furnace Punisher quite beats that out, but this could be an interesting secondary 3-drop for specific matchups. Against some decks, this is kind of just going to be a 3/3 menace for 3, which isn't really enough anymore, but if you're playing against some of the popular 3-color decks in Standard, Grixis, Esper, Mardu, those decks typically play exactly 2 basic lands. 2 basic lands, which means your opponent is almost always going to be taking 2 a turn off of this as long as it sits on the battlefield, because your opponent is unlikely to draw every basic land in their deck. That's just not very likely mathematically. So in those matchups, this is actually a good card. Like, if you can get 2 direct damage out of this, I think it's a playable. If you can get 4 direct damage out of this, it's very good. And if you get 6 or more, it probably just wins the game by itself. So keep it in mind, right now, I don't know if the meta is tilted enough towards these low basic decks to make Furnace Punisher a main deck card. But if we end up in 3-color tribal Standard, then this could be a very playable 3-drop. In older formats, I don't think it's really worth it. I looked through Pioneer decks. Most Pioneer decks have a lot of basics, so it's probably not going to be very good there. And then in Modern, there are a lot of decks that don't play very many basics, but because of fetch lands, they can just fetch out the basics they do have. So I think this is mostly a Standard-only card, but in the right meta, it can be a good one. We also got Bladed Ambassador, 2 to cast 3/1 Phyrexian Soldier. When it enters the battlefield, it gets an oil counter, and then you can pay 1, remove an oil counter from it to give it indestructible until end of turn. So this reminds me a bit of like Season Hollowblade, Adanto Vanguard. Downside is you gotta use mana to activate it, and you can only do it once unless you can add extra oil counters with Proliferate or whatever. So I don't think it's quite as good as these other cards that are similar. And in Standard, there's so much competition. Like, my first thought was, oh, it's a soldier, played in soldiers. But looking at soldiers, like, you can't even play all the good soldier 2-drops already. The big ones in mono white are like Resolute Reinforcements, Thalia, Valiant Veteran, Sun Gold Sentinel, really good card that doesn't even make the cut in most soldier decks. And that's not even including all the Azuria soldiers. So not enough room there. And then once you get to just generic mono white, then you have like Intrepid Adversary, Spirited Companion, Lion Slash. So I think this might be one of those wait until after rotation cards. I think this is a potentially playable card. Like, the comparison to Season Hollowblade Adanto Vanguard, even though it's a watered down version, I think that's enough that this can be interesting in an aggro deck fighting against the sweepers and removal of a control deck. But there's just so many options right now that we might have to wait till some of these other ones rotate to really see Bladed Ambassador. On the other hand, Cankerbloom is kind of insane. In this one, we're not waiting for rotation. This card is coming into play right away. A 2-mana green 3/2 Phyrexian Fungus. You can pay 1 and sacrifice it to blow up an artifact, blow up an enchantment, or proliferate. This is a really good card. When you consider the Outland Liberator and Cathar Commando RDC play, Cankerbloom seems very playable right off the bat. It does the same thing, plus you get the upside of being able to sack it to proliferate, which can be very relevant in some decks. So I think this is main deck playable in like mono green and Standard. Worst case sideboard all-star like Outland Liberator, just an upgraded version of that if you're not a werewolf deck. And I've even seen some people say that this could be a pretty good Pioneer card. You get a lot of flexibility, and one of the weird upsides in Pioneer compared to these other options, Outland Liberator, Cathar Commando, is you can always just sack this to proliferate, which means if your opponent like goes to Bone Crusher Giant or Cankerbloom, you can just pay 1 and sacrifice it to essentially fizzle the Bone Crusher. It doesn't go on an adventure, which is a pretty big upside compared to other versions of this effect. Finally today, we got a bunch of just other lower rarity stuff. We had a bunch come out over the weekend. We got more today, so there's a lot to look through. Not going to talk about it all. It's mostly just stuff for limited, but if you want to check it out, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Phyrexia All Will Be One spoilers for today. So what do you think? How ridiculous are these Super Friends cards? The land that can turn into artifacts, all the other stuff? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more Phyrexia All Will Be One spoilers. So until then, have a wonderful day, and I will talk to you soon.